Hey, Caleb, I want to welcome you to this episode of Discovery. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, thank you. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is the WarpStream serverless product, kind of where it plays in, how it looks, how it works, maybe some use cases around it that possibly people aren't thinking of.
Sure. Yeah. So serverless is WarpStream's fully hosted, fully managed cluster type, and it's sort of separate and distinct from our BYOC product. So BYOC is what people use for production workloads, high scale workloads, things that they want to run in their account and have, writing to their object storage. Serverless is a fully managed product, meaning that the agents run in WarpStream's VPC in AWS and writes to WarpStream's three bucket that we manage on behalf of our customers. And so
Okay.
that's sort of the big difference between serverless and BYC. It's mostly about sort of data sovereignty and running in our environment versus yours. The thing you get though using serverless is you basically don't have to manage anything. WarpStream handles spinning up the agents, spinning them down when load decreases. Auto scaling just works out of the box. You don't have to sort of think about anything or do anything. It's basically a URL on the internet that speaks the Kafka protocol and is very cost effective. So those are the big differences between BOSC and serverless.
Okay. Now, I can envision use cases like programmer testing, right? You just want to do
Yes.
something quick, make sure it works. What might be some other use cases that you're seeing from the potential customers or the customers?
Yeah, so dev clusters, like individual developer clusters, things like that, sandbox environments, that's definitely, people are using serverless for that. The reason it's great for that is that you don't have to think very much about, oh, do I keep this cluster around after I'm done with my ephemeral workload? It automatically scales to zero. And so you're not billed for a serverless cluster sitting around doing nothing, not serving any requests.
Yeah.
So that's sort of like the developer sandbox use case. We also have people that have integrated serverless clusters into their CI/CD and test suite pipeline. And the reason they use that is because when you do a deploy, it's not necessarily happening all the time. It might happen actually a few times a day for some people, maybe once a week, maybe once a month. But it's kind of important that you have a way to test and fail fast during your rollout so that you can make sure that if you're using WarpStream in production, using our BYOC cluster, for example, that everything's still going to work. And so, the agent version that we're running in serverless is the latest version that you get with BYOC that you can pull down to run yourself. And so it's pretty much a one-to-one comparison with the software. Now, the infrastructure obviously is different because it's running in our account versus whatever you're running in your environment. As far as testing functionality, that kind of workload is really good for serverless because you don't have to worry about spinning up a cluster, Kafka cluster, waiting for it to provision, waiting for Zookeeper to start, waiting for Herokus to start. You
Yeah.
don't have to like build in sleeps and stuff like that into your pipeline. Provisioning is either it's instant if you want to provision a new cluster every time, or you can just keep the same serverless cluster around. So there's a couple different ways to do it, but the gist of it is just that serverless is really good for those sort of ephemeral workloads that you don't necessarily want to have to set up and configure and manage a BYOC cluster for. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. So if you're testing, for example, and you've built something out, it's like it's all working in serverless, rolling that over to BYOC is really just a matter of credentials, then, right? Making sure your
Yeah, I
topics.
mean, once you've got the BYOC cluster set up, you're right. It's basically once you have the infrastructure up and running for BYOC, it's pretty much a matter of switching out your broker bootstrap URL and credentials for your BYOC.
That makes it easy, right?
Yeah.
So, what do you think about? Let's take a quick look at serverless in WarpStream.
Sure. I'll just take a quick walk through creating a serverless cluster. We have a little in-product tutorial that I'll run through. I'm going to create a serverless cluster. I'm just going to keep it in US East 1 because that's the default. When you create your first cluster, we drop you into this tutorial. And so this is great. You can sort of walk through this. It takes, all of 5 minutes to get end to end. And when we create this serverless cluster, we're creating an ephemeral cluster to run this tutorial on, and it automatically deprovisions itself after 60 minutes. And then the cluster I created before in the previous screen is still there. We do this to just separate your tutorial stuff from when you actually want to use the product. It cleans itself up. You don't have to worry about that.
Nice.
So I'll go next here. I already have WarpStream installed locally, but this is just telling me to download and install like the WarpStream CLI so that I
Okay.
can programmatically interact with my WarpStream serverless cluster. We created some credentials, and I'm going to copy these and use environment variables to store these credentials locally in the Bootstrap host as well. So these are my
Okay.
SASL credentials that allow me to connect to my cluster from my local machine, or if you were in AWS or something like that, it would enable you to connect basically to the serverless cluster with your client. In this case, it's the WarpStream CLI.
Okay.
Next, I'm just going to run this diagnose connection command. And what you'll see here when I run this locally is some agents are going to spin up. And so what's happening here is they received basically the diagnose connection request and
Uh-huh.
ping back to me in my terminal, which you can't see because I'm just sharing my browser window here. But what we're seeing here is that as soon as the serverless cluster receives a request, it spins up some agents. And then after a while, if there's no subsequent requests, those agents go away. They deprovision. And this is what we mean by scale to zero. It really does scale to zero. It's not serving any requests. And so if I left it here for a while, you'd see, oh, there's the second one that went away. And this third one will go away after a few seconds, but I'm not going to wait around for that. This
That's really cool.
utilization is utilization for the agent.
Okay. Yeah, and that was really fast in terms of coming up and then going back down again.
Yes. Yeah. Serverless clusters provision instantaneously and then scale down very quickly. The reason that scale to zero for serverless is not just a neat feature, but also an important feature, is because serverless clusters, if you were to keep them up for an entire month and serve requests constantly,
Mhm.
produce or fetch or metadata requests or whatever, they cost $100 a month, which is pretty cheap, but it's not nothing. And if
Yeah.
you had, 10 developers with 10 clusters, it starts to add up. Um,
Yeah.
but the cool thing, we were talking about ephemeral workloads earlier and sort of these sporadic types of workloads, is that when a serverless cluster is scaled to zero, the billing also scales to zero. And so billing scales in 15-minute increments. So you're charged the equivalent of however many minutes are in a month times 15. So in 15-minute increments, if there are requests during that period of time. And if
Mhm.
there are not, then you're not charged because there's nothing running. So that's what I meant earlier by like you can keep the cluster around forever and it doesn't really matter. It'll spin
Yeah.
up, do the work it needs to do, and then spin back down to zero when it's done.
Nice.
All right. So now we're going to create a topic. I'm doing this in my CLI. And so this topic is
Gee.
called tutorial. It was just created. It has no bytes in it because I haven't done anything with it yet. And it has the default 24-hour retention.
Okay.
And now I'm going to spin up the console producer, which basically every line that I type into my terminal will be a message.
That's really responsive though. I mean, the pace at which things are showing up is just like instant
WarpStream is a real-time system.
for
So
real.
it's around 1 second end to end produce to consume latency, around 400 milliseconds for produce latency. So I produced messages, and so within half a second they show up. So I
Nice.
produced 5 messages in my terminal. I got 5 messages here. They all made it. Um, And that's it. So we have completed the tutorial. We produced 5 messages. There's also a console consumer. So if you want to prove that it works, you can then consume those 5 messages. I'm not going to do that because I'm not sharing my terminal window now, but trust me, it would work. So you can try it yourself.
That is super impressive. Thank you.
Thanks.
I am
Yeah.
I love what's happening there. I appreciate you walking through that with me.
Sure. Yeah, and what I was saying earlier about serverless being great for these developer workloads and sandboxes, that's not to say you can't use it in production. You definitely can. It's the same grade software as everything else. We're pretty good at managing infrastructure, so it's very stable. It's totally production ready. There's no reason you can't. Uh, it's just that, many of our customers want the sort of control and sovereignty of BYOC. And because the agents are so easy to run, it just isn't that much infrastructure to manage. Like it's a almost fully managed experience to use BYOS. So unlike some of the models you might be familiar with, where you can either have self-managed software or run a fully managed product, and those are your two options. BYOC kind of bridges the gap there. And so serverless, it's wonderful for these, workloads you just don't really want to have to think that much about. But using BYOC is very easy. So, we have customers that just choose that because of all the benefits of a BYOC deployment model. The trade-off is just not that bad. But
Yeah,
yeah,
they're just
serverless.
responsible for their object store, right, in their infrastructure, which they should
Yeah,
already
that's right.
be familiar with. So,
Yeah. It's just if you want to like create new clusters on the fly, you have to templatize that and have a sort of there's non-zero work you have to do there. If you just want to give clusters to your internal customers, your internal sort of engineering team, each individual engineer has their serverless cluster they can play around with. That's a totally legitimate deployment model and pretty inexpensive to do that. The other reason that BYOC is great is because the cost is lower. If you have multiple megabytes per second of throughput, on a consistent basis, the BYOC versus serverless cost trade-off really goes in favor of BYOC. So with any serverless product, the cost is higher because it's running in our account. And a lot of that is networking.
yeah, well, that makes sense. All right. Well, thank you for describing that all.
Sure, no problem. Happy to do it.